Welcome back to Vivid Noise, and it's about time that I talk about a game that I've brought up multiple times on this channel, that being Unreal Tournament 1999. I feel like going over this game as if this were a review would be totally redundant, since there's tons of great reviews of this game already out there, like Gaming Pastime, LGR, G-Man Lives. You know, if you want a more thorough assessment of this game, just look those videos up. I'm just here to talk about not just my, experiences playing it and shooters in general, but also a phenomenon that I've noticed amongst this branch of first-person shooter, and that is to do with the single-player campaigns, or sort of lack thereof. It's no secret that games like Unreal, Quake, etc., they're much more focused on the multiplayer, right? This was really before big single-player campaigns were the norm for shooters. They still had campaigns, but this was well before the Halos and Call of Duties came in to really, I don't want to say revolutionize the campaign, but they budgeted the campaign. Like, they big budgeted, you know what I mean? Like, voice acting and just these huge cutscenes and cinematics and massive scores. That's what I'm talking about. What I'm going to talk about later is the sort of campaigns that are basically just single-player maps and events stitched together with some vague plot line. But what about my own experiences with Unreal Tournament or first-person shooters as a whole? Well, I think I might have mentioned this before in my, the Hot Wheels series that I did for Vivid Noise, and that was essentially about how I grew up playing a lot of Counter-Strike, and by playing, I never really played it too much myself, but I watched a lot of people who were older than me play it. Like, Counter-Strike was the de facto shooter where I lived, and if you live anywhere near, like, Eastern Europe, in that sort of region, you grew up on Counter-Strike as well. Fact. I also remember seeing one of my uncles play Wolfenstein 3D, but it must have been some sort of source port. I mean, at that point, we were well past the MS-DOS days, so it must have been like some updated version of it. Although it didn't really leave much of an impression. Then I later found out about Doom and Duke Nukem, and again, I think I already mentioned that Serious Sam was something that I kind of knew about, but never actually knew exactly what it was. Like, I didn't know it was a shooter, but retroactively now I know, yeah, I was exposed to that too to some extent. And I also had this one friend who's, I think his uncle was like a big computer guy, and he would get them like computer parts for cheap. So he always had like the big dick PC, right? Like, I always, as I said in, I think my low settings video, the really popular one for some reason, I had a 210, a GT 210, which is like the worst NVIDIA GPU still available. It's still available. Yeah, they still sell it. And so obviously I couldn't really play all those big boy games, but he could. And so every time I'd come over, I was like, oh my God, look at the graphics on that terrorist, Although looking back, it was all a bunch of show. We all know how, Spunk, Gargle, Weeby, those kind of games can be with like the scripting and automation. It's just like, there's not a lot of actual gameplay, whereas the boomer shooters, those are the ones with the real game part, right? Not to say that there's zero value in those kind of campaigns as well. In fact, I still hold that the original Modern Warfare campaign is fantastic, and so are some of the earlier Call of Duty campaigns, like Call of Duty 1, I quite enjoyed that one, and the Black Ops campaign was kind of interesting, mainly from like a narrative standpoint. Treyarch really spread their wings with that series before it started to focus way more on the multiplayer, and you know how it goes. Going back to UT99, before I delve into the secondary, or really would be the main topic for the video that I mentioned already about the campaigns and stuff, after playing it and Quake 3 and a couple other shooters of this kind from around that time period, something I've noticed about it is exactly how it differentiates itself from Quake 3 Arena. I mean, they were direct competitors at that point, and with Unreal Tournament, you have a much heavier emphasis on weapon choice and sort of like a rock, paper, scissors thing. It's like, this weapon is more effective against this other weapon in this specific firing mode, whereas Quake 3 is much more visceral, much faster, and much more focused just on reflexes. You can pretty much just, really the only two weapons in Quake 3 you really need are the rocket launcher and the lightning gun, pretty much. I mean, like, the rest are there too, and they can be useful if you don't have them, but the balancing is a little bit skewed, whereas with Unreal Tournament, almost every weapon has some sort of counter. There's a very strong rock, paper, scissors formula here. Like, you got your hit scans, your projectiles, your less accurate projectiles, your more accurate projectiles. And ever since I started playing on slightly higher skill levels, now in this recording I'm playing on experienced, but you generally want to go even higher than that, I found myself being a lot more conscious of the weapons that I choose depending on what my opponent is using. Not to mention that really movement isn't quite as heavily emphasized. Like, you still move I guess, faster compared to something like a modern shooter, but it's no Quake free. Or even Painkiller, right? When you're bunny hopping, I've been thinking about doing a video on Painkiller and talking, comparing it to Serious Sam. I'm still not super sure about it, but I got the thumbnail and everything ready, so I might just do it. I also think that slightly slower player speed is what gives Unreal Tournament a much more down-to-earth and polished sort of feel to the gameplay. It feels a lot less Half-Life mod-y, even though, it's actually the opposite. Half-Life, you could call it a mod of Quake. That's a different story. But what I mean is it just feels like a more professional game. I mean, it also helps that the presentation all around is much better. Let's talk about that. I mean, Unreal Tournament, its music is great. I was obviously going to start with that. You got all these different influences of drum and bass and a little bit of industrial and some metal, but also this giant faux cinematic score, because it's not really cinematic, but you got these strings, fake strings, but still it sounds very big, very attempting to be orchestral, and it does a really good job. The compositions are very strong. It may not have that big sound of like an actual orchestra, but it's really well written, right? Alexander Brennan, Michael Van den Bos, and everyone else, absolutely phenomenal job. Michael Van den Bos actually went on to work on the music for Age of Wonders, and that's literally the only reason why I'm even vaguely interested in that series, because I'm not really a big fan of strategy games. I also feel that the art direction for Unreal is just leaps and bounds that of Quake Freeze. Don't get me wrong, Quake Free has a look to it. I like how it combines a lot of elements of Quake 1, 2, and the Doom games. It's just like this id Software anthology in a way. But the colors, man, the texture work, the colors are just amazing in Unreal Tournament. Like, it still looks really nice. Obviously, the sequels, especially 2004, and Free as well, they're kind of the same visually. They look objectively better in terms of, like, the model quality and stuff, and they retain the art direction. The third one, I guess it's the fourth one, that last one looks like fucking garbage, I'm not talking about the cancel one, I mean like the one that actually released in 2007, Jesus Christ, like I may have a soft spot for piss filters. I mean, I'm a fan of Need for Speed and also a Grid as well, so I don't mind it when a game looks a little bloomy and a little washed out, but like, Jesus Christ, it doesn't work with the character models, and it just looks like Gears of War, except Unreal is totally different to Gears of War. It's like just because it's made by the same people. Anyway, that little rant aside, I can't hold that against what this game does. It's really nice to look at and easy on the ears as well. It helps that the menus actually have, well, for one, they have some sort of music to them. Quake Free did improve upon the overall presentation in Team Arena, but that was like a year later, and it was a completely separate expansion, right? Whereas this is just what the game was like. This is what Unreal was always like. So I have to call it a little bit of a case of too little too late. For some people, that is. I'm sure that there's plenty who got a lot of fun out of Quake Free Team Arena, including the developers themselves. If you've watched that, like, behind the game. No, what was it? It came out a couple years ago, this video about the developers, or one of the developers talking about, the history of Quake, and basically Team Arena was the best game that only they liked, essentially. Like, the best game just for them, the developers. Okay, I think it's about time that we move on to the main point of the video here, and that is to do with the phenomenon of these just very throwaway, but at the same time, valuable campaigns that these shooters had around this sort of time. I say that they're throwaway, but also valuable. How does that work? Well, as far as the developers are concerned, this shit is just last minute. They've already got the maps, they've already got all the art assets, they got everything done. They just have to put them together, make a simple little menu, and just make shit up, right? Oh, there's a global thing that's going on, and it's like a tournament, and they're gonna, it's being sponsored, and they make up little backstories for every area, which I think is really charming. It's like, oh, this used to be a processing factory place, right? So they used to process materials. You can fight in it now. This is an abandoned warehouse. You can fight in it now. That kind of stuff. That's really cute, for one. But aside from that, I actually feel like there's a ton of value to these campaigns to the player, specifically. So one, these games released in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was a time when, yes, the internet was very much a thing, but not everyone had access to it. Or if they did have access to it, it might have been very limited access or very slow access. It wasn't like it is today, where most of us are at least privileged enough to just sort of have the internet just like that, like at our fingertips. But that wasn't always the case back then, and so having some sort of single player content apart from just the bots must have been really great for people who actually bought the game full price, brand new. There's also the matter of teaching the players how to play. See, the thing about these kind of games is that they have very, very, very dedicated followings of very hardcore players, people who will not even allow you to spawn into the map and walk around for more than 5 seconds without just getting fragged like 50 billion times. So having a single player campaign where you can just sort of go through all the maps and figure out how all the game modes work, get accustomed to the controls, all that stuff, that must be incredibly valuable to a new player, or just someone who's not very confident, or just someone who wants to have a good time and is tired of having to try and compete with all these really high-level players who don't sleep ever and don't shower ever. That's not a dig at anyone like that, though. Major respect to anyone who can actually play a game like this at a high level. There's also something to be said about the different ways that developers put these kind of campaigns together, because it's not all the same. In fact, within the Unreal series, you've got a lot of different examples. So the first one is the simplest and my personal favorite. You've just got your, you start with Deathmatch. You got a little tutorial, but you can skip it. You just do a bunch of maps. After you've cleared an arbitrary number, you unlock Capture the Flag, then you unlock Domination, then you unlock, I believe, Assault. And after Assault, you've got like the final events where you got to take down specific characters, and finally Zan, I believe his name was, who's like the cheating bastard with the overpowered AI. Then when Unreal Tournament 2003/2004, they started expanding upon this a little bit by adding a currency system and also the ability to poach players, like really bots from different teams, and setting up your own teams, which is cool, I guess, although personally, it kind of takes away from that beautiful simplicity. And I know it sounds like super pretentious and snobby, but no, it's actually not because I care too much for simplicity and like the beauty of it, but rather because I get very, very easily overwhelmed by different systems. The fewer systems a game has, the more likely I am to enjoy it because I can comprehend more of it. And then the 2007 one added like a more involved storyline and also like heavier emphasis on vehicle combat and stuff, and it just totally lost me at that point. Anyway, these kind of campaigns aren't just limited to first-person shooters though. I've recently been trying to get back into RTS games, and what better game to use as an entry point than the absolute classic that is Warcraft 3. That game also has a campaign, and it is actually scarily high effort for the kind of game that it is. You've got full-on voice acting, this extremely well-written story actually, and the occasional cinematic moments, not to mention that the score for the game, like the soundtrack, it attempts to make even the non-pre-rendered cutscenes also feel kind of epic and momentous occasions, and I really gotta commend the effort for what is really just a glorified tutorial. That gets a little more blatant with games like, let's say, Command & Conquer Generals, where it really is just an introduction to all of the factions without that much effort in terms of the production and stuff. You can also see a similar thing happening with racing games, like for example, a lot of the more hardcore sim type games, which mainly focus on multiplayer, racing against a bunch of people in their sim rigs. Even those will have a simple campaign mode, like for example, Assetto Corsa, where it's just a bunch of events strung together to introduce you to the different vehicle types, but that's still neat that they do it at all. And for the same reasons that it's cool that games like Unreal have it, or Warcraft. It's one, in case that you just can't get online for whatever reason, although considering how much more recent Assetto Corsa is, that's far less likely, but it also serves as a great introduction and just a place where you can just kind of have fun without worrying about being competitive, because much like with shooters, hardcore sim racers, they are really dedicated to what they do. They will invest a lot into their setups and spend hours, days practicing before these actually pretty sizable events that they do. The main takeaway from this assessment of what is to a lot of people secondary content is that it helps us remember the fun of the game. It puts the video game back in the video game, if that makes sense. Sometimes all you really want to do when you boot up a game is shoot some dumb bots, race against some simple opponents, and making that possible is an incredible opportunity to increase the accessibility of your game. It really is actually kind of interesting how such a cheap addition to a game, this kind of campaign that requires very little effort on behalf of the developers, of course, unless you're talking about Warcraft 3 with all the voice acting and stuff, but for the most part, such a small investment can actually reap massive rewards. Because imagine if these kind of games didn't have a simple way to be enjoyed without internet access or about having to dedicate hours of your life getting competitive at them. Because while there is totally an art to playing these kind of games extremely well, it's not always what you want to do, and it's not for everyone. And so by spending just a little bit of time and money compared to the rest of the game, that is, the developers are opening up the doors for just so many more kinds of players that can allow for all sorts of memories to be created. You know, like everyone, whenever people talk about their memories of these kind of games, they're either about them playing in tournaments in their glory days, or just having a good time when they were kids or something, you know, just loading up bot matches, and that is a beautiful thing, honestly. And with that, I'm going to wrap up another episode of Vivid Noise. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next one.